In this section, we are going to discuss determination of exchange rates. In this section, we have to figure out how to determine equilibrium exchange rate in the forex market. As we know, if we monitor or watch some international news or monitor the exchange rate behavior, sometimes exchange rate go up, sometimes goes down. Actually, the value of the foreign exchange rate fluctuates a lot. Sometimes domestic currency depreciates. Sometimes it appreciates. Why? So in this session, we have to figure out what the factors or what reasons cause exchange rate to rise or to fall down. Okay, so the foreign exchange rate is the price, like all prices, like the commodity market. Okay, we can remind when we take the course, or took the course before, like the essential of economics, we learn the commodity markets or good markets, right? Or how to determine the price of the good market is almost the same. So in the forex market, we will adopt the same concept into the forex market. We will use the demand and the supply schedule in the markets to determine its value. The value represents exchange rate. Okay, so in this session, we will set up several assumptions in the markets. Here we assume we are Japanese. Okay, and the domestic currency is Japanese yen, and the foreign currency is US dollar. Why I don't use the Taiwan dollar? Because Taiwan dollar is not majors in the forex market. So in the forex market, the most important currency is US dollar. So that the US dollar we can call the main currency in the world. But the most frequently transaction in the world, such as Canadian dollar, euro, Swiss franc, and the Japanese yen, we call the majors. So that we have to use Japanese yen as a domestic currency, and the foreign currency is US dollar. So here I want to define the demand in the forex market, just like demand in the good market or commodity market, right? For example, Apple market. In the Apple market, how could we create the demand for apples or quantity demand for apples? Okay, we apply the concept into the forex market. Okay, so here let's define the quantity demanded for US dollars. Okay, the quantity demand of US dollars in the forex market is the amount of the traders plan to buy during a given period at a given exchange rate. So just like the quantity demand for apples, right? Okay, so here we can derive a demand curve in the Apple market, right? In the Apple market, how to derive the demand curve? As we know, when the price of Apple decreases, people will buy more apples in the Apple markets, right? Cause the quantity demanded for apples to increase. We can figure out the inverse relation between price of apple and the quantity demanded for apples. Also, we apply the concept into the financial markets, the forex markets, right? So in the forex market, actually, we can assume the apple is US dollar, right? And we can buy the apples by using Japanese yen, right? So that here we can create the demand curve for apples. For US dollar, right? So the demand curve shows how exchange rate affects the quantity demanded for US dollar. Other things remain the same. Okay, as we know, the the quantity of dollars demanded depends on the exchange rate. The exchange rate means the price of US dollar. Okay, so when you want to run the forex market, you can think about the good market, just like Apple market. Okay, so the US dollar played the role just like the Apple. We buy the Apple in terms of Japanese yen. Also, we buy the US dollar in terms of Japanese yen. Almost the same concept. We only apply the same concept from Apple market into forex market. Do remember the rule. It's very important. So here we have the law of demand for forex exchange or for US dollar. Let's remind or recall the Apple markets. Law of demand in the Apple markets holds true. Why? Due to reasons, right? Let's recall the concept of economics. Essential of economics. We learn the rule before. The rule before. Two effects, right? Cause the law of demand holds. The first effect is substitution effect. Substitution effect represents as price of apple decreases, people will buy more apples relative to other fruits, right? Maybe a family or people go to the supermarket, they want to buy apples or buy bananas or buy other fruits. But when they realize the price of apple decreases today or have a special discount, actually their behavior will push them to buy more apples relative to bananas or other fruits, right? So that they will buy more apples. The effect we call substitution effect. The other effect caused the law of demand holds, we call income effect. Income effect means for the family go to the supermarket, they want to buy the apples. Okay, initially maybe the price of apples equals $20, $20 NT for per apple. But now due to the price of apple decreases from $20 to $10, maybe they have the budget with up to 100 NT. Initially they can buy 5 apples at initial price. But when they realize the price of apple decreases, have the 50% account, okay, so that the apple, the price of apple equals $10, $10 for an apple, okay. For the family will buy more apples than before, right? Initially, 100 budget, $100 NT budget, they can buy 5 apples. But after the price of apple decreases, they can buy 20 apples, okay? So that they will make decision to buy more apples than before. The effect we call income effect. So due to income effect and the substitution effect, the two effects will force law of demand holds in the good market or in the Apple market, right? And now we apply the same concept into the forex market. But the forex market is very different from the good market. The lowest demand holds true in good market due to two effects. Let me recall again. Substitution effect plus income effect. But for forex market, the lower demand also holds true. I tell you the final result. The lower demand will hold true. Okay, but due to different reason, not substitution effect or income effect, we call the impulse effect. Impulse effect for domestic country or export effect for foreign country. Okay, now let's back to the slide. Okay, here I want to define the low demand. The low demand represent other things remain the same. The higher the exchange rate, the smaller the quantity demanded for US dollars. Okay, so we can find out the inverse relations between exchange rate actually the exchange rate represents the price of per US dollar and the quantity demanded for US dollar. We can find out the inverse relations between price of per US dollar and the quantity demanded for US dollar. What reason caused the law of demand holds true? The reason we learned it before. We call impulse effect for Japan or export effect for the US. Now, here in this slide, I would like to illustrate impulse effect for Japan. Let's recall the previous example. In previous example, I used the Ford SUV to discuss when exchange rate goes up, what happened to the quantity demand, what happened to the price of exports and the price of imports. As we know, when exchange rate goes up, the domestic currency faces depreciation. That will cause, it's favorable to exports, right? That will cause the price of exports decreases. At the same time, that will cause the price of imports to increase, right? It's unfavorable to imports, but it's favorable to exports. So it's unfavorable to imports so that the value of imports will decrease. And then we can make conclusion. As exchange rate go up, the domestic currency faces depreciation. That will cause the value of imports decreases. And finally cause the quantity for US dollars decreases, right? So we can find out the inverse relations between the price of per US dollar, the exchange rate, and the quantity demanded for US dollar. Okay, so here, let me define the impulse effect for Japan. As we know, the larger the value of the US exports, the value of the US exports means the value of Japan imports, right? The larger is the quantity the US dollar demanded on the forex market in Japan. So as exchange rate goes down or falls down, that means exchange rate decreases. The cheaper are the US made goods and services to people in Japan. The more the United States exports, the greater the quantity of US dollar demanded for pay for them. So here, we can find out the inverse relations between exchange rate and the quantity demanded for US dollar. So in this example, when current exchange rate, when exchange rate falls down or decreases, that means Japanese yen faces appreciation, right? It's favorable to imports. Why? As Japanese yen appreciate, that will cause the price of imports decreases in terms of Japanese yen, right? And the people in Japan will buy more goods or products from the US. It's favorable to imports, so that they will need more US dollars pay for imports, right? And finally increases quantity demanded for US dollar. So we can find out the inverse relations between the price of per US dollar and the quantity demanded for US dollar. So as shown in figure 1, in figure 1, I would like to show you if law of demand holds true in the forex market, we can derive inverse relations or the inverse, the negative sloping curve, just as shown in figure 1, right? So if the exchange rate rises, the quantity demanded for US dollars will decrease, as shown in the blue demand curve, right? On the other hand, if exchange rate falls, the quantity demand for US dollars will increase along the demand curve. So if law of demand holds true, that we can derive a negative sloping curve for US dollars. Here in this session, I would like to explain what reasons or discuss what reasons will shift demand curve or change the demand curve for US dollars. So here I define any change for demanded for US dollars will shift demand curve, shift to the right or shift to the left. Okay, so any influence that change the quantity demand for US dollars that people plan to buy in the forex market other than the exchange rate changes, demand for the US dollar shift demand curve. Okay, these influences or the factors are the first one, interest rates between interest rate differential between United States and Japan. Okay, we call the interest rate differential. The second one, expected future spot rate or future exchange rate. Okay, so the expected people will make prediction in the forex market. If they predict the US dollar will be more valuable, they are willing to hold more US dollar today, right? And transfer their Japanese asset into the US dollar asset in order to gain the more profit in the forex market, right? They will engage in the asset allocation in order to make more profit. So the expected future spot rate or future exchange rate will change their behavior. That will shift demand curve for US dollar, right? Now, let's discuss the two factors. The first one, interest rate in the United States and Japan. This factor we can call the interest rate differential. Interest rate differential. Okay. If we use the interest rate, the difference of the interest rate between the United States and Japan, we can use the U.S. interest rate or dollar interest rate less yen interest rate, Japanese interest rate. We call interest rate differential in the U.S. or U.S. interest rate differential. So U.S. interest rate differential equals the U.S. interest rate minus the Japan interest rate. So let's figure out if the interest rate differential increases, what happens? That means the higher the U.S. interest rate, the lower the Japan interest rate, right? The two reasons will cause interest differential to rise. Okay. For example, if the Fed, as we know, the Fed is the central bank of the U.S. The Fed make decision to raise up the Fed fund rate. Finally, cause the U.S. interest rate increases. Okay, other things remain the same. So as we know, as the U.S. interest rate increases, that will also increases the U.S. interest rate differential. So what happened to the forex market? As you know, if you are investors, one of the investors, or investors, they will engage in the rational behavior. The rational behavior is they are willing to pursue high return asset relative to low return asset. If they realize the Fed raise up the Fed fund rate and cause U.S. interest differential to increase, what happened? Their behavior, they will pursue high return asset, I mean the US dollar asset, right? They will abandon low return asset or give up the low return asset, right? So they will sell Japanese asset, right? So that what happened to the forex market? As current exchange rate, if the current exchange rate remains the same, their behavior, they are willing to hold a US dollar asset instead of Japanese asset. Their behavior will shift demand curve to the right, right? The demand curve for US dollar to the right. Why? Because their behavior, they will need more US dollar in order to hold US dollar asset, right? They will sell Japanese asset. So their behavior will cause demand for US dollar to increase and the shift demand curve to the right. Okay, so here I want to illustrate interest rate differential, how to shift demand curve. Okay. On the other hand, if the interest rate differential decreases, we will have the opposite effect. That will shift demand curve to the left. The second effect, the second factor I would like to introduce the expected future spot rate or future exchange rate. Other things remain the same. The higher the future spot rate, the greater the quantity demanded for US dollar and shift the demand curve to the right. Why? Let me illustrate the point. Because the higher the future exchange rate, the larger the expected profit from holding dollars. Almost the same reason. You can think about if you engage in your asset allocation, you want to make decision, right? Your investment decision. You can invest your money on dollar asset or Japanese yen asset, but you predict due to the inflation rate, so that the Fed want to raise up the Fed fund rate to control inflation rate. So you can predict in the future, US interest differential will increase. So what happened to your behavior? I believe for the rational investors, they will engage in the asset allocation. They want to put their asset or invest their money on high return asset. I mean, in this example, is the US dollar asset, right? And they will holding less low return asset. So their behavior will increases the demand for US dollar and shift demand curve to the right. Okay, so here we can make conclusion. The higher the expected future spot rate, the rational investors, they are willing to hold more US dollar asset. So their behavior will shift demand curve to the right in order to increase demand for US dollar. So let's combine the two factors or two inferences. Okay, so as shown in Figure 2. Figure 2 shows changes in the demand for US dollars. As I mentioned before, what factors will cause demand curve shift to the right? As I mentioned before, the first factor comes from the US interest rate differential increases. The second factor is all people, they have the prediction. They predict in the future exchange rate will go higher, okay, or the US dollar will appreciate in the future. That means the expected future spot rate increases. The two factors will shift demand curve to the right, cause demand for US dollar to increase. Otherwise, what factors will shift demand curve to the left is up result relative to previous example, right? If the interest rate differential decreases or the expected future spot rate decreases, the two factors will cause people are willing to hold more Japanese yen asset relative to US dollar asset. So their behavior will shift demand curve to the left. Now, in this session, let's discuss the supply side in the forex market. We want to figure out who supply US dollar in the market. Okay, in previous section we discussed demand for US dollar. Okay, demand side in the forex market. In this session we want to discuss the supply side in the US market. Who supply US dollar asset or US dollar in the forex market? So here we have the definition for the quantity supplied for US dollars. Okay, the quantity of US dollars supplied in the forex market is amount that traders plan to sell during a given time period at a given exchange rate. So here we also can derive the supply curve, almost the same as the supply curve in the good market. I mentioned before is the Apple market. In Apple market, we want to figure out who supply apples in the Apple market. As we know, it's farmers, right? Or suppliers, they supply apples in the Apple market, right? And we'll also know the law of supply will hold in the Apple market, always hold in the Apple market. The higher the price of apple, the supplier will supply more apples in the Apple market, okay? So that the law of supply will hold true in the Apple market. We apply the same concept in the forex market, but they have very different reasons cause law of supply will hold true in the forex market. Let me illustrate the point later. Okay, the supply curve shows how exchange rate affects the quantity supplied for US dollars. Other things remain the same. The quantity of US dollars supplied depends on the current exchange rate, almost the same like demand for US dollars. Okay, now here we also want to figure out what reasons cause the law of supply hold. Okay, so here I would like to introduce the law of supply in the forex market. Traders supply US dollar in the forex market when they buy other currencies. So what reason cause supply curve, law of supply holds? Finally, we can derive a positive sloping curve, in the forex market. Okay, so here almost like the demand side in the forex market is related to the export effect. Okay, so other things remain the same. The higher the exchange rate, the greater the quantity supplied for US dollars, so that we can derive a positive sloping curve, and we can derive the supply curve for US dollar in the forex market. Okay, so what main reason caused the law of supply holds? The reason comes from the export effect for Japan, or import effect for the US. Now, let me explain what are the export effect for Japan. As we know, the larger the value of the US imports, the larger is the quantity of the foreign currency demanded to pay for the imports. Okay, but from the point of view on Japanese, all Japanese exporters, they have to receive the payment from the US, right? So the exchange rate will affect the value of imports or exports, and the price of exports, as I mentioned before. Now, as we know, when people buy foreign currency, they supply US dollar, right? So here I want to illustrate the point or the channel why the export effect for Japan will cause law of supply holds true. Okay, other things remain the same. The higher the exchange rate, the higher exchange means the Japanese yen depreciates. As Japanese yen depreciates, that means, as we know, it's favorable to exports, right? Because the Americans, they will realize the price of exports will decreases, right? The cheaper are foreign made goods and the service to Americans. So more the United States imports, or the more Japan exports, the greater the quantity of the US dollar supplied on the forex market. Let me clarify this point. It's very easy. As Japanese yen depreciates, it's favorable to exports, right? It will reduce the price of exports in terms of US dollars. It's favorable to exports, and increases the value of exports. Okay, so that the Japanese exporters will receive more payment from the US. They will receive dollars, and they want to exchange US dollar to Japanese yen, right? So that they will supply US dollars in the forex market. Finally, increases the quantity supply of US dollars. So we can find out the positive relations between exchange rate and the quantity supplied for US dollars. Due to we can find the positive relations, okay, between exchange rate and the quantity supplied for US dollars, so that we can derive a positive supply curve. If law of supply hold, that means we can derive a positive supply curve in the forex market. So that if the exchange rate rises, Japanese yen depreciates, so that the quantity of US dollars supplied increases along the supply curve for US dollars. Okay. On the other hand, if exchange rate falls, the quantity of dollars supplied decreases along the supply curve for US dollars. So we can find out the positive relations between exchange rate and the quantity supply for US dollars. Now, we also want to discuss what factors or influences will shift the supply curve. Now, almost the same in the Apple market. We also want to figure out what factors will shift the supply curve in the Apple market, also in the Forex market, right? So here, I want to show you some reasons or some factors will shift the supply curve in the Forex market. Okay, the first one, almost like the demand curve. Okay, because the two factors will shift demand curve, also supply curve. The first one, interest rate differential. The U.S. interest rate differential, or the interest rate in the United States and Japan. The interest rate differential will not only shift the demand curve, but also shift the supply curve. Let's discuss the channel later. The second one is expected future spot rate. Again, people's expectation, people or investors' expectation, they will change their behavior so that also change the supply curve and the demand curve. Okay, now let's discuss the first factor. The first factor, I would like to show you the interest rate in the United States and Japan. Okay, as we know, the larger the U.S. interest rate differential, the smaller the demand for the foreign assets. So the smaller is the supply of the US dollar on the Forex market. For example, we only consider two kinds of assets. The first one we call US dollar asset. The second one is Japanese yen asset. As interest rate differential increases, what does that mean? That means the US dollar asset will get more profit, get more return than before, right? Okay, so rational investors or rational people, when they engage in the asset allocation, they always pursue high return asset instead of low return asset. So they are willing to hold more US dollar assets instead of Japanese assets, so that their behavior will cause supply for US dollar to decrease. Because they want to hold more US dollar assets, they will supply less US dollars. Okay, so that as exchange rate goes up, or differential in interest rate differential increases, they realize, rational investor, they realize US dollar or US dollar asset will be more valuable asset. They are willing to hold more valuable assets, right? So that they will supply less US dollars. Okay. Finally, we'll shift supply curve for US dollar to the left, or decreases supply for US dollars. The second reason, or the second inferences, we call the expected future spot rate, or again, almost the same reason. Okay, as the expected future spot rate increases, that means exchange rate will get higher. So they will realize the US dollar asset will be more valuable, so that their behavior, they will supply less US dollar in the Forex market, and reduce supply for US dollar, and shift supply curve to the left. So let's combine the two factors, or two inferences. As shown in Figure 4, Figure 4 shows the change in the supply of US dollars. Okay, as I mentioned before, as the US interest rate differential increase, and the higher the expected future spot rate, the two reasons will cause people are willing to hold more US dollars. They will supply less US dollars, and shift supply curve to the left, right? So here we call a decrease in the supply of US dollars. Otherwise, if interest differential decreases, or the expected future spot rate decreases, people they realize Japanese asset will get more profit, right, relative to US dollar asset. So their behavior, they will supply more US dollars than before. Cause supply curve shift to the right. Okay. In this session, I would like to combine supply schedule and the demand schedule in the forex market. We are going to discuss how to determine equilibrium exchange rate in the forex market. So here we have the market equilibrium. What is market equilibrium? As the demand and the supply schedule, they put them together in the forex market, we can determine the exchange rate. Almost like the good market, if we combine supply schedule and demand schedule, when supply schedule intersect demand schedule at the intersect point, we can determine equilibrium apple price. We apply the same concept into the forex market, right? So demand and the supply schedule in the forex market help us to determine exchange rate. If the exchange rate too low, as we know, there is a shortage of the dollars. If the exchange rate too high, there is a surplus of the dollars, almost the same like apple markets, right? If the equilibrium price of apples equals $20 per apple, if the current price is higher than $20, as we know, there is a surplus in the apple market. If the current price is lower than $20, there is a shortage in the apple market, right? Almost the same in the forex market. So as the equilibrium exchange rate achieved, that means there is neither a shortage nor a surplus. That's why we can determine equilibrium exchange rate in the forex market. So here, as forex market achieved an equilibrium, that means the supply schedule must intersect demand schedule. For example, in this example, the equilibrium price will be 100 yen per dollar, right? So if the exchange rate equals 100 yen per dollar, that means there is neither shortage nor surplus in the forex market. We can say the forex market is in equilibrium or achieved an equilibrium. Otherwise, if the current exchange rate is 120 yen per dollar, as you can see, there is a surplus of dollars. The surplus of dollars appears. That means, according to the market mechanism, just like Apple market, they will cause exchange rate to fall until to 100 yen per dollar. Otherwise, if the exchange rate is 80 yen per dollar, as you can see, there is a shortage of the dollars. If the shortage of dollars appears, what does that mean? The market mechanism will raise up the current exchange rate until to 100 yen per dollar. So, if the current exchange rate equals 100 yen per dollar, as you can see, there is neither a shortage nor a surplus of dollars, and the exchange rate remain constant. We can say the market is in equilibrium. So in this session, we want to discuss if any influence changes or environment changes, right? That will shift the demand curve or supply curve and how to affect equilibrium exchange rate. So in this section, we will discuss changes in the exchange rate. The predictions about the effects of change in the supply and the demand schedule are exactly the same for any other market, just like Apple market, right? An increase in the demand for dollars with no change in supply schedule raises current exchange rate. Okay, you can image. We can draw the demand and the supply curve, and as demand for dollars increases, shift the demand curve to the right, and the other things remain the same. No change in the supply curve. So as you can see, that will increases current exchange rate and also increases quantity demanded for US dollar or quantity supply for US dollar, right? And on the other hand, an increase in the supply for US dollar with no change in the demand of US dollar, that will lower the exchange rate. You can draw your figure by yourself. You draw demand and the supply schedule, and the supply schedule increases, shift to the right, and no change in the demand curve. Okay, so in this section or in this scenario, that will cause exchange rate to fall, and the increase is quantity demanded or quantity supplied for US dollar. So in last session, here, last PowerPoint slide, I would like to show you how to analyze changes in equilibrium exchange rate. Okay, so here I suggest you can follow the 3 steps to analyzing changes in equilibrium exchange rate. If you face any question or any essay questions or multi-choice questions, okay, you want to figure out these influences, how to affect or change equilibrium exchange rate. Just follow these 3 steps. Okay, the first step, if you want to determine the effect of any event happen, how to affect equilibrium exchange rate, just follow the 3 steps. Step 1, decided whether event shifts supply curve or demand curve or both. It's very important. For example, if the Fed, the central bank of the US, make a decision to raise up the Fed fund rate, how to affect the supply curve for US dollar or demand curve for US dollar? You can think about it. This event actually will affect, will shift both demand curve and the supply curve, right? Okay. For example, if the Fed raise up the Fed fund rate, maybe by 2 quarters, okay, 1 quarter is 0.25%, right? 2 quarters means 0.5%. Okay, we will have the prediction because we will realize the interest rate differential will increase. So people are willing to hold more US dollar assets, right? And they will supply less US dollar, but also demand for US dollar will increase. So they will shift demand curve to the right, and also shift the supply curve to the left. Finally, will cause exchange rate to rise. Okay, so it's very easy. You have to figure out, the first step, you have to figure out whether the event shifts supply curve, demand curve, or both. The second step, decided in which direction curve shifts. When you realize the event how to affect demand and the supply schedule, next step you have to figure out the event will shift supply curve to the right or to the left. How about demand curve? Okay, you have to think about the event how to shift supply and the demand curve to the right or to the left. Finally, use supply and demand diagram in the forex market to see how the shift changes equilibrium exchange rate. Okay, so I will use the example to illustrate how to apply 3 steps to solve the question. So here I provide active learning to discuss the shifts in the supply and the demand schedule in the forex market. Okay, I give you 2 questions in this active learning. I ask you to please answer the following questions by using demand and the supply curve in the forex market to determine its value. Okay, the first question, a rise in the US dollar interest rate, how to affect dollar to Taiwan dollar to US dollar exchange rate. Okay, so in this question, you have to figure out the event, how to affect supply curve or demand curve or both. So let me answer the first question for you, okay? A rise in the US dollar interest rate. As we know, people, they will have the prediction. They will know in the future, US dollar will be more valuable. It's a more valuable asset relative to Taiwan dollar asset, right? So people are willing to hold more US dollar asset. Okay, so cause demand for dollars to increase. So in this question, this scenario, the demand for US dollars have to shift to the right. Also, people, they realized US dollar will be more valuable asset. They will supply less US dollar at the same time, right? They want to hold more US dollars. If they want to supply US dollar, they will supply less US dollars, so that their behavior will cause supply curve for US dollar to decrease and shift to the left. So in this question, this event will affect both supply schedule and the demand schedule, right? And the shift supply schedule shift to the left, and the shift demand schedule to the right. And then you can draw a figure by yourself. Finally, we'll raise up the current exchange rate. Cause exchange rate to rise, US dollar appreciates. NT dollar, Taiwan dollar depreciates. Okay, and the second question I ask you to discuss a fall in the expected future spot rate, how to affect Taiwan dollar and US dollar exchange rate. Okay, actually it's the opposite result, right? A fall expected future spot rate means they predict in the future if they hold US dollar, they will gain less profit or make a loss, right? So the Taiwan dollar asset will be more valuable because they predict in the future US dollar will face depreciation, Taiwan dollar will face appreciation, right? So let's discuss their behavior. How to affect the current exchange rate? As you can see, their behavior according to their expectation, right? Because they predict in the future, US dollar will be less valuable, Taiwan dollar will be more valuable. So their behavior, they are holding more Taiwan dollar asset instead of US dollar asset, right? So today they will supply more US dollar, right? And the demand for US dollar will decrease. So their behavior will shift demand curve to the left and the supply curve to the right. Finally, will decreases or lower the current exchange rate, cause exchange rate to fall down. I mean the US dollar faces depreciation, Taiwan dollar faces appreciation. That's all we have for today's section, today's class.